Under a crimson sky, they thought it was only a ritual. A joke. A challenge whispered during the blood moon. But some doors, once opened, never close. What they summoned that night didn't fade with the moonlight. It watched. It learned. And now it hunts them, one by one, in the dark spaces between heartbeats. Tonight, we're unraveling a chilling story of ancient rites, forbidden names, and a presence that refuses to be forgotten. Stay until the end, because the final revelation changes everything you think you know about what answered their call. And nothing will ever feel safe again. Atmosphere, the blood moon's ominous grip. The blood moon hung low in the sky, a copper-red disk that bled into the clouds like a wound torn across the heavens. Its light filtered through the forest canopy in jagged streaks, casting long, wavering shadows that twisted and writhed across the forest floor. The trees themselves seemed to respond to this otherworldly illumination, their gnarled branches stretching like skeletal fingers, reaching out as if to claw at anything daring enough to pass beneath. Even the familiar features of the forest transformed under its crimson glare. The moss-covered stones, the tangled roots, and the thick underbrush all took on an alien, threatening quality. What was once comforting and familiar now bore the mark of something unnatural, a world slightly askew. The atmosphere, in storytelling, acts as the invisible hand that guides a reader's emotional response, and here, the blood moon serves as a natural catalyst for unease. Its crimson hue is inherently symbolic, invoking connotations of danger, violence, and transformation. Unlike a bright full moon, which often symbolizes clarity or completion, the blood moon signals disturbance, a celestial omen. By situating a narrative beneath this eerie light, the author immediately establishes a tension that permeates every element of the environment. The cold was another conspirator in this carefully orchestrated tension. It was not merely the crisp bite of autumn or the penetrating chill of winter, it was a cold that seemed to seep into the bones, the kind that whispers of mortality and vulnerability. Breath misted in the air, appearing ghostly and transient, a visual echo of the spirits that might haunt such a place. Every movement, every step that crushed the damp leaves or stirred the frost-covered undergrowth, produced sounds that seemed louder, sharper, amplified by the stillness of the night. The forest was alive with a quiet menace, not through movement, but through its oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional creak of a branch or the distant call of a night creature. These sounds, small as they were, carried weight under the blood moon, each one suggesting unseen observers, an audience of predators, or something far stranger. The shadows created under this sanguine light are central to building tension. Shadows in literature often act as both concealment and threat, hiding potential dangers while also projecting the fears of the observer. Under the blood moon, these shadows were elongated and distorted, forming unnatural shapes that moved with the sway of the wind. A fallen log might resemble a crouching beast, a cluster of rocks might seem to mimic the posture of a hunched figure. The mind, conditioned to recognize patterns, cannot help but project intent, personality, or malice onto these abstract forms. This interplay between perception and reality is a key element in creating atmosphere. The forest is the stage, the blood moon the spotlight, and the shadows are performers whose movements the human mind interprets as sinister. The forest itself became a character in this nocturnal drama. The trees, ancient and immobile, were witnesses to countless cycles of life and death. Their bark, rough and scarred, bore marks of time, disease, and perhaps even violence. Branches intertwined overhead to form a suffocating canopy, filtering the blood moon's light into fractured, red-tinged beams. The undergrowth twisted around itself like coiled snakes, roots snaking across the forest floor, ready to ensnare an unwary foot. Twigs snapped under the weight of a cautious step, creating a staccato rhythm that quickened the pulse of anyone traversing the area. Each detail contributes to a sense of claustrophobia and alertness. The environment is simultaneously beautiful and threatening, serene and hostile. This duality sustains a reader's engagement while amplifying suspense. Sound, or the careful absence of it, further enhances the atmospheric tension. The forest at night, illuminated by the blood moon, is not silent. Rather, it has a nuanced soundscape that amplifies fear. The rustle of leaves in a sudden gust of wind, the distant howl of an unseen creature, the drip of condensation from leaf to leaf, all are magnified by the stillness that dominates the scene. Silence becomes a canvas upon which every minor sound is painted with significance. The human mind, attuned to threats in the dark, interprets these noises as potential danger. Writers often use this technique to great effect. The reader's imagination fills in the gaps left by incomplete auditory information, generating a sense of tension far stronger than any overt threat could provide. Cold, shadows, and sound combine with spatial disorientation to intensify the atmosphere. The forest under the blood moon feels larger than it is, its pathways winding unpredictably, roots and rocks disrupting the terrain, forcing constant attention to the next step. Direction is hard to maintain. Familiar landmarks are distorted under the reddish light. The trees, though stationary, seem to shift when viewed from different angles, creating a subconscious sense of instability. This physical disorientation mirrors psychological unease. As the character, or reader, navigates the forest, their internal sense of safety and certainty erodes. The environment is not simply a backdrop but a participant in the tension, shaping perception and emotional response. The interplay of natural and unnatural elements is another layer in the construction of this ominous atmosphere. The blood moon is natural, yet its rarity and striking color imbue it with an uncanny quality. The forest is natural, yet the distorted shadows, whispering winds, and sense of malevolent intent give it an almost supernatural character. This tension between the familiar and the strange is critical in horror and suspense writing. It allows readers to remain grounded in reality while simultaneously experiencing the thrill of uncertainty. When a forest, a setting normally associated with life and growth, becomes a labyrinth of threat under the blood moon, it forces the audience to question the safety of the natural world itself. Visual cues such as the twisted forest and the harsh interplay of light and shadow are complemented by tactile and olfactory sensations. The frost or dampness underfoot, the smell of decaying leaves, and the sharp, metallic tang carried on the night air create a multisensory experience. When writing atmosphere, engaging multiple senses intensifies immersion, making the tension more palpable. Readers do not merely observe the environment, they inhabit it, feel it, and respond emotionally to it. This sensory engagement is what transforms mere description into a fully realized atmosphere. Beyond the immediate setting, the blood moon also carries symbolic and psychological weight. Historically and culturally, blood moons have been linked to portents, supernatural events, and upheaval. Even without explicit supernatural elements in a narrative, the presence of a blood moon primes the reader for disruption, danger, and transformation. It signals that the world is not as stable as it seems, that change is imminent, and that the normal rules may not apply. This psychological preparation is subtle but powerful, layering tension even before any action occurs. When combined with environmental descriptions, it allows for a rich, immersive experience in which every shadow, sound, and chill carries amplified significance. The forest's architecture under the blood moon further enforces this atmosphere. Narrow paths constricted by overgrown underbrush, sudden clearings that reveal nothing but darkness beyond, and steep slopes hidden by shadows create a sense of unpredictability. Anticipation, the core of tension, thrives on unpredictability. The reader cannot know what lies ahead, and the character cannot predict the forest's responses. This unpredictability forces constant vigilance, increasing anxiety and engagement. In this way, the environment itself becomes an antagonist, a living obstacle that tests the character's resolve and the reader's nerves. Finally, the psychological impact of isolation amplifies the tension of the blood moon forest. Alone beneath the red sky, surrounded by twisted trees and the eerie sounds of the nocturnal wilderness, the character's sense of vulnerability is heightened. Fear thrives in isolation. Companions provide reassurance, conversation, and distraction, but in solitude, every whisper of wind, every shifting shadow, and every distant howl gains disproportionate weight. The environment, the moon, and the forest sounds converge into a symphony of unease, a carefully calibrated emotional experience designed to immerse the reader fully in the tension of the moment. In summary, the blood moon forest demonstrates how atmosphere in writing can transform a setting into a living, breathing element of tension. Through the careful manipulation of light, shadow, sound, temperature, and spatial perception, an environment becomes more than mere backdrop. It becomes a character, a force, and a mirror of the reader's deepest anxieties. The blood moon casts a red glow that warps reality, the cold penetrates the body and mind, and the twisting forest paths ensure unpredictability. Shadows and subtle sounds exploit the human instinct to fear the unknown, while the psychological weight of isolation deepens immersion. This interplay between environmental description and emotional response exemplifies how atmosphere operates at the intersection of setting, perception, and symbolic resonance. Ultimately, the forest beneath the blood moon is more than a location, it is an experience. Every sensory detail, every distortion of reality, every echo of fear contributes to a holistic atmosphere that grips the reader, sustains tension, and transforms the ordinary into the ominous. When the moon rises blood red and the forest awakens with twisted shadows, the world itself becomes a warning. Here, in this liminal space between night and omen, the ordinary rules no longer apply, and every step forward carries the weight of unseen eyes and unspoken threats. This is the essence of atmospheric storytelling. The environment shapes the narrative as much as the characters within it, creating a pervasive sense of dread that lingers long after the last page is turned. Slow escalation in horror, from ritual to relentless pursuit. Horror, at its most enduring, is a careful game of timing, tension, and psychology. Among the most effective techniques to create lasting terror in audiences is slow escalation, where a story begins in subtle unease and gradually spirals into relentless terror. This narrative model is particularly potent when a story starts with suspenseful uncertainty, often manifesting in a ritualistic or mysterious scenario, and culminates in the outright horror of an entity actively hunting its victims. Understanding this structure requires analyzing its psychological mechanics, narrative strategies, and thematic underpinnings. 1. The foundation, suspenseful uncertainty, ritual. The opening stage of slow escalation is critical. Here, the story establishes tension through uncertainty and ritualistic behavior, allowing the audience's imagination to heighten the horror before it is explicitly revealed. Rituals, in particular, serve as an effective narrative tool for this purpose because they blend the familiar with the alien. Human beings are deeply conditioned to recognize patterns and find meaning in repeated behaviors. When a story introduces a ritual, whether it's chanting, marking symbols, or performing mysterious actions, it triggers the audience's instinct to decode the meaning. The unease comes not from what is shown, but from what is not fully understood. For example, a group of characters may gather in an abandoned structure, drawing intricate symbols with chalk while whispering incantations. At first, nothing happens. The ritual appears innocuous, or at worst, peculiar. However, the audience senses a latent danger because human cognition thrives on anticipatory fear. This is the fear of the unknown, intensified by the ritual's deliberate pacing and obscured purpose. Subtle auditory cues, like a low hum, the scrape of chalk on stone, or distant chanting, enhance tension without revealing immediate threats. The slow unfolding of these details primes the audience for escalation. The ritual stage also establishes rules and stakes. Even if the audience doesn't fully understand the ritual's purpose, they recognize that something significant is at play. Perhaps a character breaks a rule, triggering unease among the group. Or perhaps the environment itself responds subtly. Shadows lengthen unnaturally, a temperature drop is felt, or animals flee from the sight. These moments reinforce that the ritual exists within a world governed by unknown, yet consequential rules. The uncertainty is the first layer of horror, a psychological setup that will magnify the impact of the later, more explicit terror. 2. Gradual escalation, signs of the entity. The next phase transitions from subtle suspense to disturbing evidence of a lurking force. Here, the story introduces small, often ambiguous signs that something otherworldly is observing or interfering with the characters. The entity itself remains largely unseen at this stage, but its influence begins to ripple through the narrative. Objects might move slightly when unobserved, a cold breeze passes without cause, or characters hear faint whispers in languages they don't understand. This phase is crucial because it bridges the gap between psychological fear and physical threat. By presenting evidence of the entity gradually, the story maintains tension while expanding the scope of danger. The audience begins to imagine worst-case scenarios, often envisioning horrors far greater than what is shown. The power of suggestion here cannot be overstated. Horror often lives in the mind of the audience rather than on the page or screen. During this escalation, characters' reactions play a pivotal role. Denial, fear, and suspicion add layers of tension. The audience experiences a shared sense of vulnerability as they watch characters grapple with inexplicable events. Slowly, paranoia grows within the group, alliances fracture, trust erodes, and past disagreements resurface under pressure. This mirrors a broader psychological principle. Humans are inherently more fearful when they sense an intelligent, unseen adversary manipulating events around them. 3. Introducing the rules of the entity. As the story moves from ambiguous disturbances to more concrete threats, it is essential to establish the entity's rules of engagement. What can it do? How does it interact with the world? Can it be seen or communicated with? Gradually revealing these rules strengthens the horror because the audience starts to understand the stakes while still fearing the entity's full potential. For instance, perhaps the entity is bound by certain rituals, it cannot act until a specific chant is completed, or it can manipulate reality in subtle but terrifying ways, like warping reflections or altering memories. These constraints provide structure to the horror while allowing unpredictability. Effective slow escalation ensures that the entity's presence is felt more than seen at first. A shadow in the corner of a room, a fleeting reflection, or a distorted voice on a recording creates dread that grows over time, culminating in a tangible threat. The psychological impact of this phase is significant. The audience begins to recognize that the characters are trapped in a system governed by alien logic. This mirrors real-world anxieties. Humans fear what they cannot control or predict. By showing selective rules, the story balances clarity and mystery, maintaining suspense while signaling the inevitability of the approaching terror. 4. The shift, from suspense to relentless horror. The transition from suspense to active threat is the pivot point of slow escalation. At this stage, the entity stops being a background force and actively pursues its victims. This is the moment where tension is transformed into relentless horror. Unlike the ritualistic uncertainty, which relied on ambiguity and anticipation, this stage relies on urgency, visibility, and direct danger. The narrative pace accelerates. Where earlier sequences might have lingered on minor details, a flicker of candlelight, a character's hesitant glance, now the story emphasizes movement, noise, and threat. The entity begins to manipulate the environment actively. Doors slam, objects fly, and pathways become treacherous. The horror becomes kinetic, placing characters, and by extension, the audience, under continuous psychological and physical pressure. A critical aspect of this escalation is staggered revelation. The entity is often partially revealed in glimpses, building a sense of anticipation for the inevitable confrontation. Its presence is accompanied by sensory distortion. Sounds are amplified or reversed, shadows behave unnaturally, and perceptions of time may warp. These techniques immerse the audience in the character's terror, making them complicit in the chase. 5. Hunting as a psychological device. When the entity hunts its victims, slow escalation reaches its apex. Hunting is a particularly potent narrative mechanism because it introduces inescapable stakes. Characters cannot simply hide or negotiate, they must survive against an intelligent, relentless force. This stage often uses elements of predator-prey dynamics, drawing on deep evolutionary fears. The audience identifies with the hunted, experiencing heightened fear as characters make mistakes, fail to anticipate danger, or succumb to panic. Here, horror transcends physical danger and enters the psychological realm. The hunt exploits guilt, fear, and paranoia. Characters might turn on each other, misinterpret threats, or confront their own past sins. In slow escalation narratives, these elements compound, ensuring that horror is not merely external but also internal. The entity's pursuit becomes a mirror for unresolved tension, trauma, or moral failure within the characters themselves. 6. Maintaining escalation without release. A hallmark of effective slow escalation is that tension rarely resets. Unlike traditional horror that uses jump scares or isolated shocks, slow escalation builds momentum. Each frightening event raises stakes further, and the narrative rarely pauses for relief. Even moments of apparent safety are tinged with unease, shadows linger too long, whispers return after silence, or environmental cues suggest the entity is observing. This continuous build-up is essential because it keeps the audience on edge. Human attention and fear response are finely tuned to sustained uncertainty. By layering suspense over visible threat, slow escalation creates a cumulative effect. The audience's dread is not punctuated but compounded, culminating in a psychological crescendo when the entity actively hunts. 7. Visual and auditory techniques in slow escalation. For film, television, or multimedia storytelling, slow escalation benefits from careful use of visual and auditory cues. Cinematography can manipulate frame composition, lighting, and focus to create a sense of unease. Wide shots that reveal emptiness, long takes that exaggerate silence, and tight framing that obscures threats all contribute to suspense. Similarly, sound design, low-frequency drones, faint footsteps, distorted echoes, amplifies fear by signaling an unseen presence. Even in written form, authors can evoke similar effects through pacing, description, and sensory focus. Long sentences that draw attention to detail, subtle repetition of imagery, and strategic withholding of information generate anticipation. Slow escalation relies on these techniques to sustain tension across multiple stages of the narrative. 8. Thematic resonance of slow escalation. Beyond mechanics, slow escalation often conveys broader thematic meanings. Rituals at the start may symbolize human curiosity, hubris, or the desire to access forbidden knowledge. The entity's eventual hunt can reflect consequences, guilt, or the inevitability of death. This layered storytelling allows horror to resonate beyond surface scares, engaging with morality, psychology, and existential fear. In this model, the narrative structure mirrors human perception of threat. Initially, danger is abstract and uncertain, eliciting anxiety. Gradually, danger becomes tangible and unavoidable, producing terror. This mirrors how humans experience real-world crises, creating a deep psychological connection between audience and story. 9. Examples in popular media. Several iconic horror narratives utilize slow escalation to maximum effect. In The Witch, 2015, the opening sequences are dominated by ritualistic religious observance and subtle signs of the supernatural. The tension escalates gradually, culminating in a relentless, violent confrontation with evil. Similarly, It Follows, 2014, presents an unseen entity whose threat escalates from ambiguous sightings to active pursuit, sustaining dread throughout the film. Both examples illustrate the psychological and narrative potency of slow escalation. Horror grows from anticipation to unavoidable confrontation. The power of slow escalation. Slow escalation is not merely a stylistic choice, it is a psychological strategy. By beginning with suspenseful uncertainty and gradually escalating to relentless horror, stories maximize tension, fear, and audience engagement. Rituals introduce ambiguity, subtle signs suggest lurking threats, and partial revelation of the entity builds anticipation. When the entity begins to hunt, horror becomes immediate, kinetic, and relentless, capitalizing on the audience's prior investment in suspense. This model works because it mirrors human perception of threat, from abstract unease to tangible danger. It respects audience intelligence, leverages psychological fear, and allows horror to evolve organically. By pacing terror thoughtfully and layering suspense, writers and filmmakers can craft experiences that linger long after the story ends, demonstrating that the gradual, deliberate escalation of fear is often more terrifying than immediate shock. Psychological fear, the entity that preys on the mind. Fear is as ancient as humanity itself. It is hardwired into our very survival mechanisms, a primal response designed to protect us from threats. Traditional fear is tangible, the cold touch of a predator, the sudden crack of a twig in the night, or the flash of a knife in the dark. Yet, there exists a more insidious form of fear, psychological fear. This is the type of terror that lodges not in the body, but in the mind, manipulating thought, perception, and memory. When an entity preys on the mind, it operates beyond the reach of conventional defenses. It strikes in the private recesses of consciousness, where humans are most vulnerable, making it far more terrifying than any corporeal threat. Psychological fear is not simply fear of pain or death. It is fear that invades one's understanding of reality, erodes certainty, and undermines trust in one's own perceptions. Unlike physical attacks, psychological assaults cannot be fought with weapons or escape routes. They exploit the human brain's inherent weaknesses, our imagination, our memory, our capacity for anxiety, and the natural human tendency to detect patterns even where none exist. An entity that attacks on this level is less a creature of flesh and blood than a manipulator of consciousness, a predator of thoughts, emotions, and belief systems. To understand the terror of such an entity, it is important to recognize how the human mind functions under threat. The brain is not merely a thinking organ, it is a processing machine designed to predict outcomes, recognize danger, and maintain survival. When confronted with a threat, it releases stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, priming the body for fight or flight. This is manageable when danger is external and tangible. Psychological predation, however, bypasses the external entirely, targeting the mechanisms of the mind that process threat. An entity that manipulates thoughts, introduces uncertainty, or warps perception induces a chronic state of hypervigilance. Every shadow becomes a potential threat, every sound a possible sign of its presence. The victim becomes trapped in a perpetual state of fear, unable to discern reality from illusion. One of the most profound tools in the arsenal of a psychologically predatory entity is manipulation of memory. Human memory is malleable, susceptible to suggestion and distortion. Traumatic experiences, stress, and fear can already alter recall. A mind-targeting entity amplifies these vulnerabilities. Memories may be corrupted, events forgotten or altered, familiar faces may appear threatening, or conversations may be misremembered in ways that fuel paranoia. By infiltrating memory, the entity erodes the victim's sense of self, leaving them doubting their own recollections, decisions, and identity. Imagine awakening each day unsure of who you were yesterday, unsure of whom you can trust, even unsure of your own mind. This uncertainty is a breeding ground for terror, as the mind begins to turn against itself. Perception is another conduit for psychological fear. Humans rely heavily on sensory input to navigate the world safely. Light, sound, touch, and spatial awareness provide the cues that guide our decisions and survival instincts. An entity that preys on perception can distort these signals, causing hallucinations, phantom sensations, or illusions. Shadows may shift unnaturally, whispers may echo with threatening undertones, familiar rooms may seem distorted or claustrophobic. These alterations are not merely scary, they are destabilizing. The victim begins to question the reliability of their own senses, a state that gradually dissolves the distinction between reality and delusion. When the mind itself becomes untrustworthy, the very foundation of human existence feels unsafe. Emotional manipulation is another crucial facet of psychological predation. Fear is deeply intertwined with other emotions: shame, guilt, anger, and despair. An entity targeting the mind can exacerbate these feelings, twisting normal experiences into sources of torment. A simple mistake becomes evidence of failure, a fleeting negative thought is magnified into catastrophic inevitability. The victim becomes ensnared in cycles of self-recrimination and dread, unable to separate the entity's influence from their own thoughts. This emotional entrapment feeds itself. The more the victim reacts, the more the entity gains power. Unlike physical threats, which can be evaded or confronted, emotional predation is inescapable, embedded in the core of the human experience. Isolation is a key strategy for such entities. Humans are social beings. Connection with others provides reassurance, grounding, and reality checks. An entity that preys on the mind often drives its victims towards solitude, either by generating distrust, causing social estrangement, or by convincing them that others cannot understand their suffering. Alone, the victim's thoughts gain dominance, and the entity's manipulations become the primary lens through which reality is interpreted. The absence of social anchors intensifies fear, making every experience feel more personal, inescapable, and terrifying. Isolation magnifies the impact of psychological predation. It removes external verification and amplifies internal chaos. Sleep, a sanctuary for the body, often becomes a battlefield. Psychological entities exploit the vulnerability of the unconscious mind, turning dreams into tools of terror. Nightmares are intensified, recurring, and sometimes indistinguishable from waking life. Sleep deprivation follows, further weakening the mind's defenses. The boundary between dreaming and reality blurs, leaving the victim unable to discern whether the horrors are products of imagination or intrusion. In this way, even rest offers no reprieve, and the mind becomes a constant theater of dread, a never-ending stage where the entity can perform its terror. The unpredictability of psychological fear is central to its potency. The human brain craves patterns, seeking to understand, anticipate, and control its environment. An entity that targets the mind thrives on chaos, subverting expectations and exploiting cognitive biases. Events become random, causal relationships dissolve, and coincidences feel like deliberate manipulations. This unpredictability is a core component of psychological terror. It makes the mind vulnerable to suggestion, magnifies anxiety, and creates a state of chronic anticipation. The victim is not only reacting to specific threats but is conditioned to expect danger in every interaction, every thought, and every perception. The terror is further compounded by the entity's invisibility. Unlike physical threats, which can be observed and confronted, a mind-targeting entity leaves no tangible evidence. Its attacks are internal, subtle, and often dismissed as stress, mental illness, or imagination. Victims are frequently doubted by others, sometimes even by themselves. This invalidation is a form of secondary trauma, reinforcing the power of the entity. Fear is amplified by isolation, disbelief, and confusion, vulnerabilities that the entity can exploit endlessly. It does not need to be seen or physically present to dominate, control, or destroy. The mind becomes the battlefield, and the battlefield itself is invisible. Many literary and mythological examples embody these concepts. From Lovecraftian horrors to the archetypal shadow in Jungian psychology, these entities prey on the fear of the unknown, the unexplainable, and the uncontrollable. They are terrifying not because of what they are, but because of what they do to the human psyche. They invade, corrupt, and manipulate thought, memory, and perception. They illustrate that the ultimate fear is not of pain or death, but of losing control over one's own mind, of becoming a prisoner in one's own consciousness. Coping with psychological predation requires more than conventional defenses. Physical barricades are ineffective. Logic and reasoning are only partially reliable when perception and memory are distorted. Awareness is crucial. Recognizing the nature of psychological manipulation can provide some resistance. Social connections offer grounding, reality testing, and emotional reinforcement. Structured routines, mindfulness, and mental training can reduce susceptibility to panic and uncertainty. Yet, even with these tools, the threat remains profound. The human mind is vulnerable precisely because it is conscious, imaginative, and self-reflective. These qualities that allow creativity and insight also make us uniquely susceptible to psychological predation. Psychological fear also reflects a profound philosophical truth: the most terrifying predators are not always external. Humanity's greatest vulnerabilities reside within. A mind under siege is a mind facing not just danger, but the potential unraveling of its own identity. The entity that preys on the mind forces the victim to confront the fragility of reason, the uncertainty of memory, and the instability of perception. Fear becomes both internal and external. It is the fear of the entity and the fear of losing oneself to it. This duality intensifies terror because it is impossible to fully separate the source of threat from the experience of threat. The victim becomes complicit, whether consciously or not, in their own psychological torment. Furthermore, psychological entities highlight the limits of human understanding. Physical threats can be studied, measured, and anticipated. Mind-targeting entities defy comprehension. Their attacks are subtle, multi-layered, and often inconsistent with the laws of nature as humans understand them. The inability to rationalize or categorize the threat deepens fear, because the human mind naturally resists ambiguity. When conventional understanding fails, fear escalates, becoming a self-perpetuating cycle. The victim's mind is both the stage and the audience, trapped in an endless performance orchestrated by an invisible manipulator. In psychological, fear represents the pinnacle of human terror because it attacks what is most intimately ours, our minds. Entities that prey on the mind exploit memory, perception, emotion, isolation, sleep, and unpredictability to create a pervasive, inescapable sense of dread. They destabilize reality, erode trust in oneself, and undermine the foundational belief that humans have control over their own consciousness. Unlike physical predators, these entities leave no tangible trace, making their influence nearly impossible to resist or validate. Their terror is insidious, internal, and profound, rooted in the essential vulnerabilities of the human mind. To be preyed upon psychologically is to confront the fragility of thought itself, and in doing so, it becomes clear that the most terrifying predator is not outside, but within. Inevitable consequence: the summoning creates a permanent debt. The act of summoning is, at its core, a narrative fulcrum. It represents an incursion into the unknown, a crossing of thresholds between the ordinary world and the supernatural, the mundane and the forbidden. In countless myths, folktales, and works of dark fantasy, summoning is rarely a neutral act. It is not merely an invocation, a request, or an experiment. It is a contract, a confrontation with forces beyond human comprehension. And embedded within this act is the inevitability of consequence, a debt that cannot be repaid in full, a burden that lingers long after the initial summoning is complete. This inevitability is what gives stories of summoning their haunting power. It is a subtle, insidious truth that whispers in the reader's mind: some actions, once taken, cannot be undone. The nature of this debt is crucial. When a character summons a supernatural being, whether a demon, spirit, or eldritch entity, they are, knowingly or unknowingly, entering into an exchange. The specifics of the exchange vary according to the mythology or fictional universe: a soul for knowledge, a life for a boon, a moment of power for eternity of obligation. The exact terms of the debt may be formalized in a ritual, outlined in a contract, or hidden within the mysterious whims of the entity itself. Yet regardless of the form, the principle is consistent. The summoner owes something that cannot be easily reclaimed, a cost that echoes far beyond the immediate narrative. This permanent debt is not just an abstract concept. It shapes every subsequent choice, every interaction, and every moment of suspense in the story. The haunting inevitability of summoning arises from this debt. Unlike a mere threat or a fleeting consequence, a permanent debt alters the texture of reality for the characters involved. Once the ritual is performed, there is no turning back. This is a key reason why summoning narratives feel so psychologically compelling. The tension is not just external, in the form of a monster or a demon, but internal. The reader senses that the protagonist is ensnared in a web that cannot be unraveled, that each decision, each attempt to control or escape the consequences, only tightens the web further. The debt is a narrative device that ensures the story's stakes are absolute. There is no reset button, no divine intervention to erase the consequences, only the slow, inexorable weight of the obligation that has been incurred. Consider, for example, classic depictions of summoning in European occult traditions. In grimoires and treatises, summoning is rarely framed as a casual experiment. The magician or alchemist who invokes a spirit does so with elaborate preparations, warnings, and protections. These texts often stress that failure to adhere to the ritual can result in possession, madness, or death. Implicit in these warnings is the understanding that the act itself binds the practitioner to the spirit. Even the careful magician cannot fully escape the obligation that is now a part of their existence. Here, the debt is both practical and symbolic. Practically, the magician may owe obedience, secrecy, or service to the summoned entity. Symbolically, the debt represents the broader truth of human desire. Reaching beyond natural limits comes with costs that cannot be undone. In literature and folklore, this principle is magnified. Stories of summoning often frame the consequences as both literal and metaphorical. The summoned being may demand payment, wreak havoc, or manipulate reality, but the true horror lies in the permanence of the debt itself. A tale in which a protagonist summons a demon to save a loved one might end with the loved one being restored, but the summoner becomes haunted, psychologically, morally, or physically, by the consequences of their choice. The debt manifests as guilt, as vulnerability, or as an inexorable string of misfortunes that are narratively unavoidable. In this sense, summoning stories are uniquely equipped to explore the tension between desire and responsibility, ambition and consequence. They dramatize the idea that no action exists in a vacuum, and some actions, once undertaken, echo forever. The psychological resonance of permanent debt in summoning stories is particularly significant. Humans are wired to perceive causality, and stories thrive on the tension between choice and consequence. A summoning that incurs a permanent debt leverages this instinct. Even when the entity itself does not immediately punish the summoner, the knowledge that the debt exists creates a pervasive sense of dread. The protagonist, and the audience, cannot ignore the cost, cannot escape the moral or existential weight that has been placed upon them. This awareness transforms ordinary suspense into a deeper, more existential tension. The story is no longer about surviving a particular monster or completing a specific quest. It is about living with the inevitable consequences of one irrevocable act. The narrative becomes haunted, not just by the summoned entity, but by the indelible truth of debt itself. Moreover, the permanence of the debt fosters narrative inevitability. Unlike stories in which choices can be reversed or consequences mitigated, summoning creates a sense of linear, inescapable progression. Once the ritual is completed, the narrative cannot retreat, the chain of cause and effect is unbroken. This inevitability is crucial to the emotional impact of the story. Readers sense that no clever trick, no sudden revelation, will fully erase what has been incurred. The haunting quality of the story arises precisely because the debt is enduring. It mirrors real-life experiences of irreversible decisions, amplifying the tension and tragedy. This is why summoning narratives often feel simultaneously intimate and cosmic. The protagonist's personal choices reverberate across supernatural and narrative scales, intertwining the human and the otherworldly. It is also worth noting how the concept of permanent debt interacts with themes of temptation and hubris. Summoning often represents a desire to circumvent natural limits, to gain knowledge, power, or influence that would otherwise be unattainable. The summoner's initial intention, be it noble or selfish, intersects with the supernatural to produce unintended consequences. The permanent debt functions as a narrative equalizer. It ensures that ambition is never cost-free. In this sense, the haunting inevitability of summoning is closely tied to moral and philosophical questions. The debt is not only practical, it is ethical. It forces characters to confront the implications of their desires, to grapple with responsibility in ways that are deeply human, even as the story veers into the fantastical. In many narratives, this permanent debt is also generational or societal. The consequences of summoning may extend beyond the individual, affecting families, communities, or entire worlds. A protagonist who calls forth a demon may find that their descendants inherit the lingering curse or obligation, that their actions ripple outward into history. This amplifies the narrative weight of summoning. The act is no longer an isolated incident, but a node in a broader web of consequence. Stories of this kind often explore themes of legacy, inheritance, and the intergenerational cost of human ambition. The haunting inevitability is thus both personal and collective. The debt is at once intimate and inescapable, a narrative echo that resonates across time. Structurally, the permanent debt introduced by summoning serves as a mechanism for tension, pacing, and climax. In classical story design, stakes must escalate, and suspense must compound. The inescapable debt ensures that tension never fully dissipates. Even in moments of apparent resolution, the reader remains aware that the cost exists and will demand reckoning. The narrative cannot return to equilibrium because equilibrium has been permanently disrupted. This structural function is central to the emotional impact of summoning tales. Readers are drawn into the inexorability of the plot, invested in outcomes they know will be shaped by the immutable debt incurred at the story's inception. Examples abound in folklore and fiction. In the Faustian tradition, the protagonist trades his soul for knowledge or power, establishing a debt that can never be cancelled. In Lovecraftian mythos, summoning rituals call forth cosmic entities whose motivations are inscrutable and whose consequences are unavoidable, leaving characters psychologically scarred or physically destroyed. In modern dark fantasy, summoning often comes with moral ambiguity. A character may succeed in achieving their goal, yet the permanent debt, manifested as guilt, obsession, or manipulation, ensures that triumph is never unqualified. Across genres and traditions, the principle is consistent. Summoning is a narrative act that binds the summoner to consequences beyond their control, and this binding creates the story's haunting inevitability. The aesthetic and symbolic resonance of permanent debt in summoning stories is equally compelling. Debt is a human concept, tied to morality, economics, and social obligation. By transposing this concept into a supernatural framework, stories allow readers to explore the implications of transgression, ambition, and responsibility in intensified, often terrifying forms. The supernatural debt becomes a lens through which we examine our own ethical and existential frameworks. The haunting inevitability of summoning narratives thus operates on multiple levels, as plot device, psychological tension, moral allegory, and symbolic meditation on human limitation. Ultimately, the permanent debt of summoning stories serves a singular narrative function. It transforms desire into consequence, action into inescapable responsibility, and story into a meditation on inevitability. It ensures that the narrative stakes remain absolute, the tension continuous, and the thematic resonance profound. By introducing an unrepayable debt, summoning narratives compel both characters and readers to confront the reality that some acts cannot be undone, some choices cannot be retracted, and some desires carry costs that echo across time and consciousness. This is the essence of the haunting inevitability, a truth that lingers, unspoken yet omnipresent, shaping every moment of the story and every shadow in the reader's imagination. The permanent debt of summoning is, therefore, more than a mere plot device. It is a narrative philosophy, a structural principle, and a psychological instrument. It allows stories to explore the human condition in ways that are simultaneously fantastical and profoundly real. It ensures that the story resonates long after the final page is turned, because the debt, like the act that incurred it, cannot be erased. In this way, summoning becomes not just an act of magic, but a mirror reflecting the immutable truths of human ambition, responsibility, and mortality. The inevitability of consequence, in these tales, is both terrifying and illuminating. It is the heartbeat of narrative tension, the shadow that haunts the protagonist, and the unbreakable chain that links desire to consequence in the haunting architecture of the story. If this story chilled you, remember, curiosity can be dangerous when it crosses into the forbidden. The blood moon has faded, but some shadows never leave. If you heard something, saw something, or felt watched while listening, you're not alone. Leave your thoughts in the comments, but choose your words carefully. If you enjoyed this nightmare, like the video, subscribe for more true and fictional horrors, and share it with someone brave enough to listen after dark. Until next time, keep the lights on, trust your instincts, and never answer a call you don't understand when darkness whispers back softly.